along the misty banks of the Ashley River in South Carolina, where Spanish moss draped ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the air hung thick with secrets older than memory, stood Magnolia Grove Estate. In the spring of 1852, this sprawling rice plantation, with its grand Georgian mansion and perfectly manicured gardens, became the setting for what Charleston society would remember as the most beautiful wedding that ended in the most horrific tragedy. On a single May evening, when dogwood blossoms perfumed the air and mockingbirds sang their borrowed melodies, 19 members of the lowcountry's most distinguished families gathered to celebrate love and unity. By dawn, not one of them would see another sunrise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The authorities called it a mysterious illness, perhaps contaminated shellfish from the Charleston markets, or spoiled cream in the elaborate desserts. The newspapers spoke of divine punishment for unnamed sins, but the truth lay deeper than any investigation dared to venture. Hidden in the calloused hands of a woman who had learned that patience, when seasoned with the right ingredients, could serve justice more effectively than any court of law. This is the story of Rebecca Freeman, a kitchen slave who discovered that the most exquisite revenge is often served alongside the finest cuisine. Rebecca Turner had spent 18 years of her life believing that knowledge was freedom, that skill could purchase safety, and that excellence might somehow transcend the brutal mathematics of human ownership. Standing in the heart of Magnolia Grove's kitchen house on that humid April morning in 1852, surrounded by copper pots that gleamed like captured sunlight, and shelves lined with spices that had traveled oceans to reach her hands, she embodied everything the plantation system promised but rarely delivered. A slave so valuable, so irreplaceable, that her position seemed almost like privilege. The kitchen house itself was a testament to the Ashford family's commitment to culinary excellence. Unlike many plantations, where cooking happened in cramped quarters attached to the main house, Magnolia Grove boasted a separate building designed specifically for food preparation. High ceilings allowed heat to rise and dissipate, while large windows provided natural light for detailed work. 3 massive hearths dominated the space, each equipped with iron cranes for hanging pots and adjustable hooks for controlling cooking temperatures. A brick oven built into one wall could accommodate multiple dishes simultaneously, and work tables crafted from thick cypress planks provided ample space for preparation. But it was Rebecca who transformed this well-appointed space into something approaching magical. At 26, she possessed an intuitive understanding of flavors that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed her work. She could taste a sauce and immediately identify not just every ingredient, but the precise moment when each had been added to the pot. Her hands moved through spice combinations with the confidence of a pianist playing familiar melodies, creating harmonies of taste that made grown men close their eyes in reverence. The Ashford family had built their social reputation on Rebecca's abilities. Colonel Edmund Ashford, a man whose grandfather had arrived in Charleston with little more than ambition and a talent for acquiring land, understood that in the competitive world of low-country society, a superior table could elevate a family's status more effectively than bloodlines or bank accounts. When prominent families from Charleston society accepted invitations to Magnolia Grove, they came not just for the colonel's conversation or his wife's constant nervous hospitality, but for the culinary experiences that emerged from Rebecca's kitchen. Rebecca had arrived at Magnolia Grove as an 8-year-old child in 1834, part of an estate sale from a failing Virginia tobacco plantation. The journey south had been her first glimpse of how quickly a life could be dismantled and reconstructed according to someone else's convenience. One day, she had been helping her mother tend a small garden behind their cabin, learning the names of herbs and their uses. The next, she was standing on an auction block in Charleston, watching strange faces evaluate her potential value like farmers assessing livestock. Colonel Ashford had purchased her not for field work, but specifically for the kitchen, having heard from the Virginia plantation's overseer that the child showed unusual promise around food preparation. It was an investment in future reputation, a long-term strategy that would take years to mature, but potentially transform his family's social standing. He paired her immediately with Aunt Dinah Washington, the elderly cook who had been training kitchen staff at Magnolia Grove for over 2 decades. Aunt Dinah became more than a teacher to young Rebecca. She became the closest thing to a mother the girl would know after being torn from her birth family. Born in what she remembered as a place of endless grasslands somewhere across the ocean, Dinah had been brought to America as a teenager and sold to a rice plantation on the Combahee River. She carried within her memory not just recipes and cooking techniques, but ancestral knowledge about plants, healing, and the hidden properties of things that grew wild in the Carolina lowcountry. During Rebecca's first months at Magnolia Grove, Aunt Dinah would wake her before dawn to walk through the plantation grounds in the cool morning air. These expeditions served multiple purposes: gathering ingredients for the day's meals, teaching the child to identify useful plants, and sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of African women who had learned to survive in an alien land by adapting their traditional wisdom to new environments. Aunt Dinah taught Rebecca that every plant had multiple purposes. The same root that favored a soup could, in different preparation and dosage, cure stomach ailments or induce sleep. Leaves that added subtle bitterness to vegetables could also treat fevers or calm nervous conditions. Seeds that enhanced the flavor of bread possessed other properties that wise women had understood for centuries. This knowledge came with strict warnings about responsibility and the difference between healing and harming, lessons delivered with the gravity of sacred instruction. More unusually for a slave, Aunt Dinah had somehow learned to read and write, skills she had acquired decades earlier from a sympathetic overseer's wife who had since died. She passed this dangerous knowledge to Rebecca in secret, using cookbook pages and recipe instructions as teaching materials. During long winter evenings, when kitchen work slowed, would show Rebecca how to form letters in flour spread across a work table, how to decipher the words in Mrs. Ashford's collection of recipe books, and how to keep her own records of discoveries and experiments. The old woman always emphasized that reading was both power and peril for someone in their position. It opened doors to understanding that could be transformative, but it also created expectations and dangers that illiterate slaves never faced. A reading slave was valuable but also threatening, useful but potentially dangerous. Knowledge, Aunt Dinah warned, was like fire. It could warm your house or burn it down, depending on how carefully you controlled it. By the time Rebecca reached adulthood, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It absorbed not only Aunt Dinah's culinary expertise, but also her understanding of plants, her literacy, and her philosophical approach to survival through excellence. When the elderly woman died suddenly of fever in the winter of 1850, Rebecca naturally inherited her position as head cook, along with responsibilities that extended far beyond food preparation. Rebecca's transition to leadership came at a time when her personal life was flowering in ways that made her feel, for the first time, that she might build something lasting within the constraints of her circumstances. She had married Joshua Turner, Magnolia Grove's head blacksmith, in a ceremony that took place in the small chapel that served the slave quarters. Joshua was a skilled craftsman whose abilities with iron and steel made him nearly as valuable to the plantation's operations as Rebecca was to its social reputation. Their marriage had produced 3 children who represented both Rebecca's greatest joy and her most profound vulnerability. William, called Billy by everyone on the plantation, was 9 years old in 1852 and already showing the intelligence and curiosity that marked him as his mother's son. He had inherited Rebecca's gift for understanding how things worked, though his interests ran more toward mechanical problems than culinary ones. He could often be found near his father's forge, watching the transformation of raw metal into useful tools, with the same fascination Rebecca brought to combining ingredients. Grace, at 7, possessed a gentle nature that endeared her to everyone in the quarters. She had developed a particular interest in the herb garden that Rebecca maintained behind the kitchen house, asking endless questions about which plants could help with headaches, which ones made the best tea for upset stomachs, and which ones smelled sweetest when dried. Rebecca saw in her daughter a natural healer, someone who might carry forward Aunt Dinah's knowledge of medicinal plants. Little Samuel, 5 years old and full of energy that seemed to exceed his small frame's capacity to contain it, brought laughter to the family's evening hours. He had inherited his father's sturdy build and his mother's quick mind, though his attention span was still that of a child who found the world endlessly entertaining. He could be found anywhere on the plantation grounds, making friends with chickens, chasing butterflies, or sitting quietly while Rebecca worked, content just to be near his mother. The family lived in a cabin that was larger than most in the quarters, a privilege that reflected Rebecca's importance to the household operations. It contained 2 rooms, a main living area with a small fireplace and table, and a sleeping area with beds that Joshua had crafted himself. Rebecca had added touches that made it feel like home: curtains sewn from fabric remnants, a small collection of books hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters that filled the space with pleasant aromas. Their life together had established routines that provided stability within the larger uncertainty of their circumstances. Joshua left for the forge each morning before sunrise, returning in the evening with stories about the tools he had repaired, the horseshoes he had fitted, or the conversations he had overheard among the white men who brought work to his shop. Rebecca's days were consumed by kitchen duties, but she made time each evening to help her children with lessons she taught them in secret, passing along the reading and writing skills that Aunt Dinah had given her. The children understood that their education was dangerous knowledge that must never be revealed. They practiced writing letters in the dirt behind their cabin, erasing them quickly when anyone approached. Rebecca taught them numbers using cooking measurements, geography through stories about where different spices originated, and history through tales of how their grandparents had lived. These evening lessons were conducted in whispers, with constant awareness that discovery could result in severe punishment for the entire family. Rebecca's position as head cook provided her family with small but significant advantages within the plantation's hierarchy. They received better food than field hands, including occasional meat and fresh vegetables from the kitchen garden. Rebecca could sometimes provide her children with small treats: a piece of cake from a dinner party, fruit that was past its prime for the main house table but still perfectly good for eating, or sweets that she made during her rare free time. More importantly, her role gave her access to information about the Ashford family's plans and moods. She heard conversations between Colonel Ashford and his guests about business matters, political developments, and social events. She observed the family's relationships and tensions during meals she prepared and served. This knowledge allowed her to anticipate changes that might affect her family's circumstances and to prepare for potential difficulties. The kitchen itself had become Rebecca's domain in ways that extended beyond her official duties. She supervised a staff of 4 younger women: Lucy, who helped with basic food preparation and cleaning; Hannah, who managed the plantation's dairy operations and bread baking; Clara, who specialized in desserts and preserves; and Martha, who handled the herb garden and maintained the supplies of dried seasonings. Each woman had been trained by Rebecca according to methods Aunt Dinah had developed, creating a team that functioned with remarkable efficiency and coordination. Rebecca's leadership style combined high standards with genuine care for her staff's development. She taught each woman not just specific techniques, but the underlying principles that would allow them to adapt and improvise when circumstances required creativity. She shared Aunt Dinah's philosophy that cooking was both craft and art, requiring technical skill but also intuition and emotional understanding of the people being fed. The kitchen's reputation extended beyond Magnolia Grove's boundaries. Other plantation owners in Beaufort County would inquire about borrowing Rebecca's services for special occasions, though Colonel Ashford rarely agreed to such arrangements. Her skills were too valuable to risk losing, even temporarily. Instead, he would occasionally loan out one of her assistants, always with the understanding that they were representing Magnolia Grove's culinary standards and must perform accordingly. Rebecca's expertise had evolved to encompass not just traditional lowcountry cuisine, but specialties from across the American South and even international dishes that she had learned from recipe books and conversations with visiting guests. She could prepare everything from simple field-hand meals of rice and vegetables to elaborate French-inspired courses that would impress Charleston society's most sophisticated palates. Her she-crab soup had become legendary among the families who had tasted it, and her desserts were spoken of in reverential tones by ladies who normally competed fiercely over their own kitchen achievements. But Rebecca's most closely guarded knowledge remained the plant lore that Aunt Dinah had shared with her during those early morning walks. She maintained her own garden behind the kitchen house, where she grew herbs that served multiple purposes: culinary seasonings, medicinal remedies, and other plants whose properties she understood but rarely had occasion to use. This garden was her private laboratory, where she experimented with combinations and preparations that expanded her understanding of how natural substances could affect human health and behavior. The spring of 1852 had brought news that would transform Rebecca's carefully ordered world. Charlotte Ashford, the colonel's 20-year-old daughter, was engaged to Alexander Beaumont, son of one of Charleston's most prominent judicial families. The wedding was planned for late May and would represent the social event of the season, bringing together low-country society's most influential families for a celebration that would establish the young couple's position in Charleston's hierarchy. For Rebecca, the wedding represented both opportunity and challenge. The success of such an important social event would depend largely on her culinary abilities, and a triumph could further enhance her value and her family's security within the plantation structure. But the scale and complexity of the celebration would require months of preparation, coordination with Charleston suppliers for specialty ingredients, and management of a kitchen operation far more elaborate than anything she had previously undertaken. Colonel Ashford had made it clear that this wedding must be perfect. His family's reputation, his daughter's future happiness, and his own standing in Charleston society all depended on the event's success. Rebecca understood that her role in achieving this perfection was both crucial and potentially precarious. Excellence would be expected and possibly taken for granted. Any failure would be remembered and blamed. As she stood in her kitchen that April morning, reviewing the preliminary menu plans that Mrs. Ashford had discussed with her the previous day, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility that came with her position. She was trusted with tasks that could elevate or destroy her owner's social standing, yet she remained property that could be sold, separated from her family, or punished according to their whims. The contradiction between her importance and her powerlessness was a tension she had learned to navigate, but never to resolve. The wedding would bring together families whose wealth and status were built on the same system that defined Rebecca's existence as property rather than person. Judge Beaumont owned 3 plantations and over 400 slaves. The other invited families controlled similar empires of human bondage disguised as agricultural enterprise. They would gather to celebrate love and unity, while their prosperity depended on the systematic denial of both to the people who served them. Rebecca had begun to understand that her skills, her knowledge, and her position gave her a kind of power that her owners neither recognized nor anticipated. She could influence their health and comfort in ways they never considered. She had access to their private conversations and personal habits.
She possessed knowledge about plants and preparations that extended far beyond anything they imagined. Most importantly, she had learned that excellence could be a form of camouflage, allowing her to hide capabilities and intentions behind a facade of devoted service. The wedding preparations would provide her with unprecedented access to the lowcountry's elite families, all gathered in one place, all dependent on her hospitality for their comfort and satisfaction. It would be an opportunity to demonstrate her mastery of her craft, to serve justice in forms that only she would recognize, and to prove that even the most powerless could find ways to balance scales that had been weighted against them for too long. As Rebecca began her preparations for what would become the most important event of her life, she carried within her heart both the love that motivated her and the knowledge that would enable her revenge. The wedding of Charlotte Ashford and Alexander Beaumont would indeed be remembered for generations, but not for the reasons anyone anticipated. It would become the night when a kitchen slave proved that true power lies not in ownership, but in understanding exactly how much control you actually possess. Part 2. The Shadows Gather. Harrison Ashford had returned from his studies at the College of Charleston in the autumn of 1851 with degrees in law and literature, along with appetites that his education had refined rather than civilized. At 24, he possessed his father's calculating intelligence, but lacked the older man's understanding that true power required patience and discretion. Where Colonel Ashford exercised control through systematic management and carefully maintained relationships, Harrison preferred more immediate and personal demonstrations of his authority. Harrison had spent his college years among Charleston's elite youth, learning not just academic subjects, but social attitudes that transformed casual cruelty into sophisticated entertainment. His professors had filled his mind with classical philosophy about natural hierarchies and divine order, while his classmates had shown him practical applications of these theories in their treatment of those they considered inferior. Harrison had absorbed these lessons with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that his worst impulses could be justified through intellectual framework. His return to Magnolia Grove had coincided with his father's plans to expand the plantation's social influence through Charlotte's strategic marriage to Alexander Beaumont. Harrison understood that his sister's wedding represented an opportunity for the family to establish permanent connections with Charleston's most prominent judicial families.
Charleston's judicial and political elite, connections that would prove valuable for his own future career in law and politics. But the months of preparation and his parents' preoccupation with social planning had left him with considerable freedom to pursue his own interests. Harrison had developed what he considered a scholarly fascination with the psychology of subordination. He believed that understanding how inferior beings could be most effectively controlled would serve him well in his future legal career, where he would need to manage juries, intimidate witnesses, and establish dominance in courtrooms. The plantation slave population provided him with convenient subjects for his research into the most efficient methods of maintaining authority through carefully calibrated applications of fear and humiliation. His experiments began with subtle psychological pressure applied to house servants who came into contact with him during daily activities. He would issue contradictory instructions and then express disappointment when they couldn't be followed simultaneously. He would praise someone's work in the morning and criticize the same performance in the afternoon, creating confusion about expectations that left his targets constantly anxious about their adequacy. He discovered that uncertainty about standards created more lasting anxiety than consistently harsh treatment because it prevented people from developing reliable strategies for avoiding punishment. Harrison's attention had gradually focused on the slave quarters, where families lived in closer proximity and stronger emotional bonds provided more interesting opportunities for psychological manipulation. He began making unannounced visits to the quarters during evening hours, ostensibly to check on living conditions, but actually to observe family interactions and identify relationships that could be leveraged for control. He learned which children belonged to which parents, which couples seemed most devoted to each other, and which individuals appeared to hold informal leadership roles within the community. The young master had developed a particular interest in what he called educational games, activities designed to teach slave children about their proper place in the plantation's hierarchy while providing him with entertainment.
These games typically involved impossible choices, situations where children were forced to choose between conflicting loyalties or competing desires. He would offer a piece of candy to one child, but only if another child performed some humiliating task. He would praise one child's intelligence while demanding that a sibling demonstrate their inferiority through comparison. Rebecca had become aware of Harrison's activities through conversations with other women in the quarters, but the reports were often fragmented and unclear. Mothers would mention that their children seemed more nervous after Harrison's visits, but the children themselves were reluctant to describe what had happened during these encounters. The young master had impressed upon them that his games were special secrets that shouldn't be shared with adults, adding an additional layer of psychological pressure to his manipulations. The spring of 1852 had brought intensified preparation for Charlotte's wedding, which meant increased activity throughout the plantation as everyone contributed to ensuring the event's success. The heightened focus on perfection and the importance of impressing distinguished guests had created additional stress for everyone involved, from field hands who were expected to ensure the grounds looked immaculate to house servants who would be responsible for managing the comfort of dozens of important visitors. For Rebecca, the wedding preparations had become all-consuming. Mrs. Ashford consulted with her almost daily about menu details, ingredient sourcing, and logistical coordination. The scale of the celebration would require food preparation that began weeks in advance, with preserved items, specialty breads, and elaborate desserts that needed careful timing to reach perfect completion on the wedding day. Rebecca had created detailed schedules for every aspect of food preparation, coordinating the efforts of her kitchen staff with delivery schedules from Charleston suppliers and harvest timing from the plantation's own gardens. The complexity of managing such an elaborate event while maintaining daily food service for the family and plantation workers had stretched Rebecca's time and attention to their limits. She found herself working from before dawn until late evening, supervising food preparation, planning logistics, and training her assistants in techniques they would need for the wedding feast. The pressure to achieve perfection had become a constant weight on her mind, particularly because she understood that any failure would reflect not just on her abilities, but on her family's security within the plantation structure. During these intense weeks of preparation, Rebecca had less time available for supervising her children's activities. Billy, Grace, and little Samuel had been spending more time playing with other children in the quarters while their mother worked extended hours in the kitchen. This change in routine had created opportunities for Harrison's attention to focus on Rebecca's children in ways that she was too busy to notice until it was too late. Harrison had observed Rebecca's children during their play periods and had become intrigued by their apparent intelligence and confidence. Billy's mechanical curiosity and Grace's gentle nature had caught his attention as potentially interesting subjects for his psychological experiments. He had also noticed that the children seemed to possess an unusual degree of education for slaves their age, displaying knowledge of letters and numbers that suggested someone had been teaching them to read and write. The discovery of Rebecca's children's literacy had presented Harrison with what he considered a fascinating opportunity. Educated slaves represented a particular kind of challenge to proper authority because knowledge created aspirations that conflicted with acceptance of subordinate status. He had read extensively about methods for managing educated servants in classical literature and contemporary political philosophy, and he saw Rebecca's family as a chance to apply these theories in practice. Harrison's approach to Rebecca's children had begun subtly with casual conversations during his visits to the quarters. He would ask Billy about the mechanical projects he observed at his father's forge, testing the depth of his understanding while gathering information about Joshua's work and capabilities. He would compliment Grace on her knowledge of plants and herbs, encouraging her to describe what she had learned while learning details about Rebecca's garden and the extent of her botanical knowledge.
Conversations had gradually evolved into more structured interactions that Harrison described as educational opportunities. He would bring books from his father's library and ask the children to identify letters or read simple words, ostensibly to assess their abilities, but actually to confirm his suspicions about their illegal education. When the children demonstrated reading skills that exceeded what any slave should possess, Harrison expressed delight at their cleverness while internally cataloging this information as potential leverage against their family. The psychological games had escalated slowly, beginning with simple tests of obedience and gradually incorporating elements designed to create anxiety and confusion. Harrison would give Billy complex tasks that required skills the 9-year-old didn't possess, then express disappointment at his failures. He would ask Grace to choose between helping her brothers or following his instructions, creating impossible dilemmas that left her feeling guilty regardless of her choices. He would encourage little Samuel to demonstrate his intelligence by answering questions that had no correct answers, then suggest that his confusion proved he wasn't as smart as his siblings. These interactions had been carefully scheduled to occur when Rebecca was most occupied with wedding preparations and when other adults in the quarters were busy with their own responsibilities. Harrison had developed a talent for timing his visits to coincide with periods when his activities would be least likely to attract attention or interference. He had also impressed upon the children that their conversations were special privileges that other children wouldn't understand, creating a sense of exclusivity that discouraged them from sharing details with their parents or friends. The psychological pressure had begun affecting the children's behavior in ways that Rebecca had attributed to the general stress of wedding preparations rather than specific manipulation. Billy had become more withdrawn and anxious, particularly around mechanical tasks that he had previously enjoyed. Grace had started having nightmares that she couldn't clearly describe, waking up frightened but unable to explain what had scared her. Little Samuel had developed nervous habits like fidgeting with his clothes or avoiding eye contact when adults spoke to him. Rebecca had noticed these changes, but had convinced herself they were temporary responses to the disrupted routines and heightened tension that accompanied major plantation events. She had tried to provide extra comfort and attention when her schedule allowed, but the demands of wedding preparation had left her with limited time for addressing her children's emotional needs. She had planned to focus more attention on family matters after Charlotte's wedding was successfully completed. Harrison's experiments had been building toward a more elaborate demonstration that he had conceived as the culmination of his research into the most effective methods of psychological control. He had identified an abandoned tobacco barn on the far edge of the plantation property, a structure that had been unused since Colonel Ashford had converted most of the plantation's tobacco acreage to rice production. The building was isolated enough to provide privacy for extended activities while being close enough to the quarters that children could be convinced to visit without raising immediate suspicion. The young master had begun preparing the tobacco barn as what he called his laboratory, a place where he could conduct more sophisticated experiments in psychological manipulation without interference from other adults. He had cleaned out debris and arranged seating areas where children could be positioned for various activities. He had gathered materials for games and tests that would allow him to explore the limits of obedience and the breaking points of emotional resistance. Harrison's plan had involved gradually introducing Rebecca's children to the tobacco barn as a special place where they could receive advanced education unavailable to other slave children. He would describe it as a private classroom where he could teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic skills that would make them more valuable servants in the future. This educational framework would provide justification for extended private sessions while creating anticipation that would encourage the children to participate willingly in their own manipulation. The wedding preparations had created perfect conditions for Harrison's plan because Rebecca's preoccupation with kitchen duties meant she was unlikely to notice her children's absence during the extended periods his experiments would require. The general excitement and activity surrounding the approaching celebration would provide cover for unusual movements and schedule changes that might otherwise attract attention.
Most importantly, the success of the wedding had become so crucial to the family's reputation that any disruption or scandal would be particularly devastating. On May 15th, with the wedding still 2 weeks away, but preparation activities reaching fever pitch, Harrison had approached Billy, Grace, and little Samuel while they played behind the slave quarters. He had brought with him a collection of books and writing materials, along with special treats that he described as rewards for students who participated in advanced lessons. The children, accustomed to his educational games and encouraged by their secret literacy to believe they were exceptional, had readily agreed to accompany him to the special classroom he had prepared. The tobacco barn had been transformed into an elaborate set for psychological experimentation. Harrison had arranged chairs in specific positions that would allow him to observe facial expressions and body language while controlling the children's ability to see each other or communicate. He had prepared a series of tests designed to create increasing levels of anxiety and confusion, beginning with impossible puzzles and escalating to choices between equally unacceptable alternatives. The educational session had begun innocently enough, with Harrison testing the children's reading abilities and praising their skills while gathering evidence of their illegal education. He had then introduced competitive elements, asking each child to demonstrate superiority over their siblings in various tasks. When these competitions failed to produce the level of distress he sought, he had escalated to more direct psychological pressure. Harrison had informed the children that their literacy was evidence of serious crimes that could result in severe punishment for their entire family. He had explained that teaching slaves to read was illegal and that families who violated this law could be separated and sold to different plantations. He then offered them a choice. They could protect their family by participating in a special educational program designed to demonstrate that they were exceptionally intelligent and loyal.
In special training that would teach them to hide their education properly, or they could refuse and accept responsibility for their family's punishment. The children, terrified by threats against their parents and unable to understand the true nature of the choice they were being offered, had agreed to participate in whatever training Harrison required. This consent had provided him with the psychological leverage he needed to escalate his experiments while maintaining the fiction that the children were willing participants in their own education. What followed had been hours of systematic psychological torture disguised as advanced learning exercises. Harrison had created scenarios where the children were forced to choose between protecting each other and following his instructions. He had demanded that they confess to crimes they hadn't committed and accept blame for problems they hadn't caused. He had threatened consequences for their parents based on their performance in tasks that were designed to be impossible to complete successfully. The psychological pressure had intensified throughout the afternoon as Harrison became increasingly absorbed in his experiments and less concerned with maintaining the educational pretense. The children's obvious distress had only encouraged him to explore more extreme methods of manipulation, convinced that he was gathering valuable data about the breaking points of human psychological resistance. By evening, Billy, Grace, and little Samuel had been reduced to trembling, confused children who no longer understood what was expected of them or how they could protect their family from the punishments Harrison had threatened. Their attempts to please him had become increasingly desperate as his demands became more contradictory and his expressions of disappointment became more severe. Harrison had finally decided that his research required a more dramatic conclusion, something that would provide definitive data about the ultimate limits of psychological control. He had informed the children that their education was now complete, but that the final examination would require them to remain in the tobacco barn overnight to demonstrate their commitment to protecting their family's secrets. He had explained that this test would prove their maturity and worthiness for the advanced knowledge they had received. The children,
exhausted by hours of psychological manipulation and terrified of the consequences Harrison had threatened for their family, had accepted this final requirement despite their fear of spending the night alone in the isolated building. Harrison had assured them that he would return in the morning to evaluate their performance and determine whether they had successfully learned to keep their family's secrets safe. What Harrison had actually done was secure the tobacco barn's doors from the outside and set fire to the building. Part 3. The fire that changed everything. The thick smoke rising from the abandoned tobacco barn was first spotted by Moses, the elderly butler who had served the Ashford family for over 30 years. He had been returning from the Ashley River landing, where he had supervised the arrival of specialty ingredients shipped from Charleston for the wedding feast, when he noticed the dark column ascending against the late afternoon sky. His initial thought was that field hands might be burning brush or clearing debris, but the location seemed wrong for such activities, and the density of the smoke suggested something more substantial than controlled burning. Moses altered his route to investigate, his years of experience having taught him that unusual occurrences on plantation property required immediate attention. As he approached the tobacco barn, the acrid smell of burning wood mixed with something else, something that made his stomach clench with sudden dread. The structure that had stood unused for years was now completely engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking through gaps in the weathered boards, while black smoke poured from every opening. The sound that emerged from his throat was not quite human, a primal recognition of catastrophe that bypassed rational thought and connected directly to the deepest fears that haunted every slave community. He began running toward the quarters, his aged legs moving faster than they had in years, shouting for help with a voice that carried desperation across the evening air. Other slaves emerged from their cabins and work areas, dropping tools and abandoning tasks as they recognized the urgency in Moses's cries. Rebecca heard the commotion from the kitchen house, where she had been supervising the preparation of tomorrow's bread dough, a task that required precise timing to ensure freshness for the weekend's pre-wedding festivities. The sound of Moses's voice, cracked with emotion and strain, cut through her concentration like a physical blow. She had never heard him sound frightened before, and his fear transmitted itself to her instantly, setting her heart racing before she even understood what had caused his distress. She abandoned her work and ran outside, joining the stream of people moving toward the source of the shouting. The sight of the burning tobacco barn struck her with immediate terror, not because of the fire itself, but because of a mother's instinctive understanding that disaster and missing children were often connected. Her mind began calculating frantically. When had she last seen Billy, Grace, and little Samuel? How long had she been absorbed in kitchen work without checking on their activities? The enslaved community of Magnolia Grove had developed response systems for emergencies that required no formal organization or leadership. Water buckets appeared as if by magic, passed from hand to hand in efficient chains that stretched from the nearest well to the burning structure. Men who worked in the fields during daylight hours became firefighters in the evening, their knowledge of teamwork and coordination immediately applicable to this new challenge. Women gathered children and counted heads, ensuring that everyone was accounted for while the men fought the flames. Rebecca moved through the crowd with growing panic, searching faces and calling names. Other mothers were doing the same thing, the shared understanding that children were naturally drawn to forbidden places created a collective anxiety that spread through the group like contagion. The questions began immediately. Had anyone seen the Turner children? When were they last noticed? Where had they been playing before the fire started? Joshua arrived from his forge still carrying the hammer he had been using when Moses's shouts reached him. His face bore the soot and sweat of his trade, but his eyes held the focused intensity of a man confronting his worst fears. He and Rebecca found each other in the crowd without words, their shared terror requiring no explanation. Their parents instantly grasped the awful association between the fire and their missing children. "Oh Lord," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. "Where are the children, Joshua? Where are they?" Joshua's eyes darted around the crowd, searching for 3 tiny figures, but they were nowhere to be seen. And then, a sickening odor reached him. A smell of cooked fat blended with the smoke of wood. "No, no," he whispered. "No." The implications of that smell were too horrifying to contemplate clearly, but he knew with certainty that his worst fears had come true. He pushed his way through the crowd, heading toward the burning tobacco barn, his mind numb with the shock of what he was discovering.
Explanation. Together they began a systematic search, calling their children's names while fighting the growing certainty that something terrible had happened. The fire proved too intense for the bucket brigade to control effectively. The tobacco barn had been built decades earlier from pine lumber that had dried to tinder over years of abandonment. The flames consumed the structure with a hunger that seemed almost alive, crackling and roaring with an energy that transformed wood and air into heat and destruction. The volunteer firefighters could only prevent the blaze from spreading to nearby trees and undergrowth, containing the disaster rather than defeating it. As the fire began to exhaust its fuel and settle into a more manageable burn, the search for the missing children intensified. Teams spread out across the plantation grounds, checking every possible hiding place and play area. The slave quarters were searched cabin by cabin. The area around Joshua's forge was examined thoroughly. The herb garden behind the kitchen house was investigated. Every location where children might logically be found was systematically explored. Colonel Ashford appeared as the fire was entering its final stages, having been summoned from the main house by reports of the emergency. His primary concern was clearly the potential for property damage and disruption to wedding preparations rather than any casualties the fire might have caused. He questioned Moses about the fire's origin while surveying the scene with the calculating gaze of a man assessing financial losses. His inquiries focused on whether the blaze posed any threat to more valuable buildings and whether its smoke might affect guests who were scheduled to arrive for pre-wedding events. Mrs. Ashford followed her husband at a distance, her pale features made even more ghostly by the orange light of the dying flames. She pressed a handkerchief to her nose and mouth, whether from the smoke or from revulsion at being in close proximity to the slave quarters, and made frequent references to the need to return to the main house where wedding preparations were waiting for her attention. Her nervousness, always pronounced, seemed amplified by the chaotic scene and the disruption to her carefully planned schedule. Harrison Ashford was notably absent from the scene, a fact that several people remarked upon without initially finding it significant. His absence was explained by various theories. He might be in Charleston on business, or visiting friends, or simply unaware of the emergency because he had been in a distant part of the plantation when the fire began. Nobody questioned his whereabouts directly because nobody had reason to suspect his involvement in the disaster. As the flames died down enough to allow closer inspection of the ruins, the horrible truth began to emerge. The barn's doors, which should have been able to swing open easily, appeared to be secured from the outside. Chains and metal hardware that had survived the fire showed evidence of deliberate fastening that would have prevented anyone inside from escaping. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd as people began to understand that the fire had not been an accident. The search for the missing children took on new urgency as the reality of deliberate arson became apparent. If someone had intentionally set fire to the barn and secured the doors, then any people trapped inside would have faced certain death. The systematic search of the plantation grounds expanded to include areas that had previously seemed unlikely, as parents and neighbors refused to accept the terrible possibility that the children might have been inside the burning building. Rebecca's search had become increasingly frantic as the hours passed without finding her children. She moved through the darkness with a desperation that bordered on madness, calling their names until her voice became hoarse, checking and rechecking locations where they might be hiding or sleeping. Joshua followed her closely, providing physical support when her legs threatened to give way and emotional grounding when her fear threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational thought.
The discovery of the bodies came near midnight, when the ruins had cooled enough to allow careful examination of the barn's interior. 3 small forms were found huddled together in what had been the farthest corner from the door, embraced in a position that suggested Billy had tried to protect his younger siblings with his own body during their final moments. The intense heat had made identification difficult, but personal items that had survived the flames confirmed what everyone had already begun to fear. The sound that emerged from Rebecca when she saw her children's remains was unlike anything the plantation community had ever heard before. It was not quite a scream, and not quite a moan, but something more fundamental, a vocalization of loss so profound that it seemed to come from someplace deeper than human language could reach. The sound continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, until her voice failed completely and left her with only silent trembling that shook her entire body. Joshua's reaction was different but equally devastating. He simply stopped moving, standing frozen beside the ruins as if his capacity for action had been completely drained by the magnitude of what he was seeing. His face became a mask of incomprehension, unable to process information that contradicted everything he had believed about his ability to protect his family. He remained motionless until other men physically guided him away from the scene, his mind apparently unable to accept what his eyes had witnessed. The plantation community's response to the tragedy revealed both the strength of their bonds and the limitations of their power. Women who had known Rebecca since her arrival as a child surrounded her with physical comfort and emotional support, creating a protective circle that shielded her from curious stares and unwanted questions. Men who worked alongside Joshua offered practical assistance, taking over his forge duties and ensuring that his responsibilities would be maintained during his period of grief. But beneath the surface solidarity lay a deeper current of fear and rage that could not be openly expressed. Everyone understood that 3 children had been murdered, deliberately trapped and burned alive by someone with the power to commit such an act without fear of consequences. The careful investigation that revealed evidence of arson would lead nowhere, because no authority existed that would seriously investigate crimes against slave children. The community's grief was compounded by the knowledge that justice would never be served through official channels. The Ashford family's response to the tragedy was revealing in its focus and limitations. Colonel Ashford expressed appropriate regret for
loss of valuable property, both the barn itself and the 3 young slaves who had represented future economic assets. He announced a brief investigation into the fire's cause, though this inquiry was clearly intended to prevent future property damage rather than identify anyone responsible for the deaths. His primary concern remained the potential impact of the tragedy on wedding preparations and the possibility that guests might be disturbed by reminders of unpleasant events. Mrs. Ashford's reaction was characteristic of her nervous temperament, but also reflected deeper attitudes about the relative importance of different kinds of suffering. She expressed sympathy for Rebecca's loss, while simultaneously worrying about how the tragedy might affect kitchen operations during the crucial pre-wedding period. Her comments revealed a fundamental inability to understand slave families as emotional units comparable to white families, viewing the deaths instead as disruptions to household management that would require practical adjustments. Harrison Ashford returned to the plantation 2 days after the fire, claiming to have been visiting college friends in Charleston during the time of the tragedy. His expression of shock and sadness at learning about the children's deaths seemed appropriately genuine to those who observed it, and his questions about the fire's cause appeared to reflect normal curiosity rather than guilty knowledge. He offered to assist with the investigation in any way possible, volunteering information about the barn's previous condition and suggesting possible explanations for how the fire might have started. The funeral for Billy, Grace, and little Samuel took place in the small cemetery that served the slave quarters, a patch of ground behind the cabins where generations of Magnolia Grove's enslaved community had been laid to rest. The service was conducted by Elder Washington,
an elderly man who had assumed spiritual leadership of the quarters after learning to read well enough to study scripture. His words offered comfort, rooted in Christian faith, while acknowledging the particular pain of losing children to violence rather than natural causes. Rebecca's behavior during the funeral alarmed those who knew her well. She remained completely silent throughout the service, showing no emotional response to the prayers, hymns, or expressions of sympathy offered by friends and neighbors. Her face had become a mask of emptiness that revealed nothing of her internal state, and her physical stillness suggested a disconnection from her surroundings that worried people who had known her as a vibrant and engaged person. Joshua's grief followed a more recognizable pattern, with periods of intense sobbing alternating with phases of exhausted numbness. His emotional reactions seemed proportionate to the magnitude of his loss, and his occasional acceptance of comfort from friends suggested that he retained connections to the community that might eventually help him heal. But Rebecca's complete withdrawal from emotional expression created concerns that she might be experiencing a kind of psychological break that could become permanent. The days following the funeral brought additional challenges, as the reality of continuing life on the plantation reasserted itself despite the tragedy. Wedding preparations could not be indefinitely delayed, and Rebecca's role as head cook meant that her participation was essential for the event's success. Colonel Ashford made it clear through intermediaries that he expected normal kitchen operations to resume immediately, and that any disruption to wedding plans would be viewed as evidence of inadequate dedication to family responsibilities. Rebecca returned to work with a mechanical efficiency that disturbed everyone who observed it. She performed her duties with technical perfection, but without any of the creativity or passion that had previously characterized her cooking. Her interactions with kitchen staff became purely functional, focused on immediate tasks rather than the mentoring and collaborative relationship she had previously maintained. She spoke only when necessary and never smiled or showed pleasure in her work. The transformation in Rebecca's personality was particularly evident in her relationship with Joshua, where they had previously shared evening conversations about their children, their work, and their hopes for the future. She now sat in complete silence during their time together. She responded to his attempts at communication with minimal acknowledgement and showed no interest in physical comfort or emotional intimacy. Their cabin, which had been filled with family life and quiet happiness, became a place of isolated grief, where two people lived separately despite their physical proximity. The other women in the quarters recognized the signs of someone whose grief had moved beyond normal mourning into something more dangerous and permanent. They had seen similar transformations in women who had lost children to sale, disease, or violence, and they understood that Rebecca was at risk of losing herself entirely to the magnitude of her loss. Their attempts to provide support and encouragement met with polite but distant responses that suggested she had withdrawn to a place where human connection could no longer reach her. But beneath Rebecca's apparent emotional numbness, something else was growing. During the long hours when she lay awake in her cabin staring at the ceiling, her mind was not empty, but rather focused with laser intensity on a single question. Who had killed her children, and how could they be made to pay for their crime? The mechanical performance of her daily duties provided cover for internal processes that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with planning. Rebecca had begun to remember conversations, gestures, and incidents from recent weeks that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now suggested patterns of behavior that pointed towards specific individuals. Harrison's increased presence around the quarters, his particular interest in her children, his questions about their activities and abilities, and his convenient absence during the fire began to form a picture that explained both the tragedy and its perpetrator. The realization of Harrison's guilt, brought with it a clarity of purpose that cut through her grief like sunlight through fog. Rebecca understood that no official justice would ever be pursued for the murder of 3 slave children, regardless of how clear the evidence might be. But she also understood that her position as head cook provided her with opportunities for unofficial justice that could be far more satisfying than anything any court might provide. The knowledge that Aunt Dinah had shared with her during those early morning walks suddenly took on new significance. The information about plants that could heal or harm, the understanding of dosages, and the ability to introduce subtle disguises in familiar recipes. All the techniques and knowledge that had seemed useful only for healing purposes now had a dark yet compelling relevance as weapons of vengeance.
Preparations that could affect human health in subtle or dramatic ways. The wisdom about timing and patience that separated successful healers from dangerous amateurs. All of this became relevant in ways that Aunt Dinah had probably never intended, but had certainly understood were possible. Rebecca began making nocturnal expeditions to gather plants that grew in the swampy areas around the plantation, using knowledge that had been dormant since Aunt Dinah's death, but had never been forgotten. She collected roots that could cause stomach ailments, leaves that could induce sleep or sleeplessness, and seeds that carried toxins capable of affecting the nervous system in various ways. Her herb garden behind the kitchen house began to include specimens that had no culinary purpose, but possessed other properties that she remembered from her mentor's careful instruction. The wedding preparations provided perfect cover for experimentation and planning. The complexity of menu planning, the need to coordinate with multiple suppliers, and the requirement for dishes that would impress sophisticated guests gave Rebecca legitimate reasons to request unusual ingredients and conduct tests of new recipes. Her reputation for culinary excellence meant that unusual requests were approved without question, and her known perfectionism provided explanation for any additional time spent in food preparation. Rebecca's transformation from grieving mother to calculating agent of justice occurred gradually but inexorably during the weeks following her children's funeral. Each day brought new understanding of her capabilities and new appreciation for the opportunities that her position provided. She began to see the upcoming wedding not as a professional challenge or social obligation, but as the perfect venue for serving justice that had been too long delayed. The plantation community noticed changes in Rebecca's behavior, but interpreted them as signs of healing rather than planning. Her return to efficient kitchen management was seen as evidence of resilience and dedication. Her careful attention to wedding details was viewed as appropriate professional focus. Her increased interest in plant gathering and preparation was understood as therapeutic activity that helped her cope with grief while contributing to her work responsibilities. Only Joshua sensed that something fundamental had changed in his wife beyond the natural effects of mourning. Her silences felt different from grief, more purposeful and less empty. Her movements carried intention that seemed disconnected from immediate tasks. Her eyes held focus that suggested she was seeing things invisible to others. But his own grief was too overwhelming to allow him to investigate these observations, and Rebecca's apparent functionality discouraged him from interfering with what seemed like progress toward healing. As Charlotte Ashford's wedding day approached, Rebecca Freeman began to understand herself differently. She was no longer Rebecca Turner, the valued cook who sought security through excellence and hoped to protect her family through indispensability. She was becoming someone new, someone who had learned that security was an illusion and protection was impossible, but who had also discovered that knowledge and opportunity could be combined to create power that transcended the formal structures of plantation hierarchy. The woman who had once believed in the possibility of carving out space for happiness within the constraints of slavery was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some wrongs could only be addressed through direct action. Rebecca Freeman had been born in the ashes of the tobacco barn where her children died, and she would use the wedding celebration to announce her existence to the world in ways that no one would ever forget. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.